You've been reading a lot of Myth to Power this week, and one of the central themes in the book is what they call REM theory, which stands for Racial Esoteric Moralization. Ta-da. And I don't want to focus on the theory itself, really. Instead, I want to apply the theory to a work of art that I really value. So essentially, it's the idea that artists will commonly use a theme of racial conflict as a central theme in storytelling, and that this form of storytelling informs the subconsciousness of viewers from a very young age, and then informs later on into their adulthood their how they select partners. And that on a wide enough scale or a long enough timeline, that this form of some subconscious information will actually affect genes. So in essence, they're saying almost that race is a cultural construct instead of what we're typically used to when we say that culture is a racial construct. The borders of races are actually made by myth crafting and storytelling. And again, not to focus on the theory itself, instead I want to focus on one of my favorite films and argue that it's an example of Aryan inner moralization, or another central concept in the book called AIM. Before I get into that, the details of the actual film, I want to briefly discuss the film's writer and visual designer, which would be first Jim Henson, which I'm sure everybody knows, and somebody not a lot of people might know, which is Brian Froud. Brian Froud is one of my favorite artists when I was a kid. I had his book, and he's one of the foremost visual artists to represent European paganism. Anyways, before all these disgusting anti-Semites line up and start yapping the question, no, Jim Henson is not Jewish. At least not that I could find. His parents, Betty and Paul Henson, worked in pretty underwhelming careers, and I could only find that they are most likely Anglo-Americans. Their family comes from Mississippi, which, as most people know, the American South is kind of the central hub for Anglo founding stock. Before all, the dirty German and Irish immigrants started pouring in. Anyways, the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco actually confirms this position. They say they actually have a section of the museum dedicated to Henson works, like Sesame Street, etc., but they say that Henson himself isn't part of the tribe. Anyways, Henson is apparently the primary writer and conceptual artist behind it. I did find a couple other people that worked on it, but it seems like most of the ideas and most of the script really just came from Henson. Anyways, so what is AIM, and what makes something AIM? Now, this is kind of up to interpretation, sadly. Myth to Power actually laments this fact. Sadly, of all the feats of Aryans, our constructive, productive, powerful outlook on the world, we're great industrialists, warriors, farmers, and we understand the world through the soil. But we actually aren't really great storytellers very commonly. And much of how we have constructed stories, we borrow from other cultures. And cultures that, have their head in the clouds more. Like Jews, for example, a nomadic, mystic people who created the Abrahamic faiths. Well, the book does give a few, but at least one hard example of AIM. Conan the Barbarian.
From the gods of the sky. But Crum is your god. Crum, and he lives in the earth. Once giants lived in the earth, Conan. And in the darkness of chaos, they fooled Crum. And they took from him the enigma of steel. Crum was angered, and the earth shook. And fire and wind struck down these giants, and they threw their bodies into the waters. But in their rage, the gods forgot the secret of steel and left it on the battlefield. And we who found it are just men. Not gods, not giants, just men. And the secret of steel has always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. For no one in this world can you trust. Not men, not women, not beasts. This you can trust.
So Conan is a Germanic, Nordic, you could say Aryan figure, and he's ancient. He's pre-Christian. You know, in the film, it's almost depicted like his people are living still in somewhat the Stone Ages. You could say essentially he's not corrupted by outside forces. He represents like a tribe of people who are untainted, so he's pure. He's not affected by Eastern, mysticism or philosophies. So what is Conan's morality? Famously, he says,
Again! We won again! This is good. But what is best in life?
The open steppe, fleet horse, falcons at your wrist, and the wind in your hair.
Wrong! Conan, what is best in life?
To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women.
That is good.
Now, bizarrely, and it's almost alien to people in the West, when he says this, it's not presented like this is a bad thing. This is just the way of his people. It's part of his pre-Eastern morality. And what does he, as an Aryan warrior with morality, do? Well, he struggles against a cult which you could be considered proto-Christian. Noted by all their serpentine aesthetics, hearkening to Python. But also they have this sort of hippie oneness kind of religion. It's giving orgy. It's giving we're all one in, Christ. It's a fundamentally populist or maybe universalist religion, completely unlike Conan's, pagan god Crom. Anyways, this isn't a video about Conan. Instead, I want to talk about how this may reflect AIM and the subtext, and what that's telling the viewer. When you're watching Conan, the subtext is look how powerful he is and look how shameless he is as a warrior. He's, bride gathering. He's collecting all these beautiful girls over and over, and they're just amazed by, because he's this big, brutish monster. And look at him crush this, snake cult, which is telling me that you're supposed to love what is Aryan. You're supposed to seek Aryan partners, and you're supposed to act out against non-Aryan gods. It could be seen that that is the subtext of the film. Anyways, how does this line up with Dark Crystal, though?
Another world, another time, in the age of wonder. 1,000 years ago, this land was green and good, until the crystal cracked. For a single piece was lost, a shard of the crystal. Then strife began, and two new races appeared. The cruel Skeksis, the gentle mystics.
So Dark Crystal, it's a fantasy world. It's a world that's been dying for a long time. You can almost call it dark fantasy. It's a story of the struggle for the future of the world fought between the Gelflings and the Skeksis, right? Which are two races locked in a struggle. I think you see where I'm going. So I'm not quite sure how to begin with this, but we'll start where Mark Brahmin likes to, with etymology. So the protagonist of the film is a Gelfling named Jen. And I don't think it's much of a secret. Well, Gelfling, of course, is just elfling, right? But the word elf comes from a Proto-Indo-Aryan word from albus, right? Which means white. And that's easy to think. Albino. Albino has a similar, origin. It means white. People know this. So elves have always had this very Aryan or white appearance. And that's true whether it's Tolkien or Kirkbride. People understand that elves generally are stand-ins for Aryans in storytelling. But what about his name? All right, his name is Jen. Well, the name Jennifer is derived from the Welsh word Gwyn or Gwen. And all you Dark Souls fans out there will no doubt know that that means white, as in, Gwyn or the Way of White. So far, so good. His name is Jen, which means white. and he is white, and he is comes from a people called white. Sounds, Aryan to me. Well, what about the secondary protagonist? His woman, Kira. Well, Kira, if it's derived from the Celtic-inspired translation, could mean black. But I find this sort of unlikely because Kira doesn't have black hair; she has white hair. And just look at this scene. You could say that she might be the whitest character in all of fiction. I mean, it doesn't get much whiter than, like, platinum white hair and, like, you're a fairy riding a bunny. I mean, a white bunny. This is the platonic ideal of the color white. So Kira could also be seen as coming from the Egyptian word Cyrus, which means sun. Now, that makes a lot of sense. Aryans are a solar people. This makes sense. I mean, Jewish texts even admit this fact. Anyways, I'll delve more into that claim, but suffice to say that Gelflings, Jen and Kira, are used to represent Aryans. Now, the Gelflings, their race, are a nearly extinct people. They've been hunted down by the Skeksis because of a prophecy that the Gelflings will take away the Skeksis' power, which sounds a lot like, this can never happen again, kind of Shoah-coded language. And here's what I think is the strongest case for this film to have an AIM undertone, because the Skeksis are probably the most Jewish-coded characters in all of fiction. They are these ancient, I mean that like aging, they're old, reptilian, avian, corrupt, evil despots, and they're hunched over, and they're wringing their hands, and they're whining with their hook beaks. And they're cruel, and they're sending their army of golem and flock cameras to hunt down the last Gelfling, who are the only ones that could take, their power from them. But what about the other similarities that they might have? Well, in no particular order, I'm just going to jot down a few that I noticed last night when I watched the film, in no particular order. So first of all, they've ruled Thra, which is the world that the movie takes place in, for 1,000 years. Which, if they had said 6 million years, I think this would be an open and shut case. But 1,000 years, that could be a reference maybe to the millennial reign of Christ. There's also 10 of them, which could represent possibly the 10 tribes of Israel. In the beginning of the film, they are put in frame and, quote, perform the ceremony of the sun.
Once more they gather at the crystal as the first sun climbs to its peak. For this is the way of the Skeksis. As they ravage the land, so too they learn to draw new life from the sun. Today, once more, they will replenish themselves, cheat death again, through the power of their source, their treasure, their fate, the dark crystal.
Which to me seemed like a weird choice. Why is this evil as evil gets group of pale lizard creatures praying to the sun? Until you realize they are actually, quote, drawing new life from the sun, as in preying on the sun, the people of the Gelflings, right? Which sounds weird, but what is the other way that Skeksis extend their life? They extend it by the search for essence.
Drain your living essence. Then you can be the same as the other podlings here. A slave. Open the wall. Now, podling. Out there is the great shaft of the castle. Position the reflector. The reflector will capture the beams of the dark crystal floating high above. Look into the reflector, podling. Feel the power of the dark crystal.
Which they get from acquiring it from Gelflings. This could be a reference to the myth of bloodletting, or as the Italian historian Ariel Toth says, it appears that a considerable number of Ashkenazi Jews traditionally regarded Christian blood as having powerful magical properties, and considered it a very valuable component of certain important ritual observances at particularly religious holidays. Obviously, obtaining such blood in large amounts was fraught with considerable risk, which greatly enhanced its monetary value, and the trade in the vials of that precious commodity seems to have been widely practiced. Toph notes that since the detailed description of the Jewish ritualistic murder practices are very similarly described in locations widely separated by geography, language, culture, and time period, they are almost certainly independent observations of the same rite. Furthermore, he notes that when accused Jews were caught in questions, they often correctly described obscure religious rituals, which could not have possibly been known to their Gentile interrogators, who often garbled minor details. Thus, these confessions were very likely to have been concocted by the authorities, or not to have been concocted by the authorities. So, not to say that that's a fact, that's just, Nick Fuentes, I think, quoted that historian once, and I just wanted to give it for context of the claim, the myth that that Jews perform these bloodletting practices. It's also a similar theme to collecting adrenochrome from Gentiles, like in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. These are famous examples or myths tied to Jews collecting Gentile blood. It's also hearkening back to the Epstein files this year, not to claim that they were collecting blood in the files, but this is just sort of the cultural image of Jewry, essentially. It's a famous myth. But back to the ritual, again, it's a cognate to me. This essence gathering, both, rituals result in the extension of the performer's lifespan. So you could say that the sun obviously represents this solar people in the Gelflings, the same way that they're collecting the blood. It's the same form of bloodletting ceremony. Another thing we notice about the Skeksis is that they worship the dark crystal, which to me, I automatically want to say that that's Yahweh, just because, if I'm making the analogy, these are Jews, their God is Yahweh. But there's some more. The crystal, for no particular reason, hovers over, quote, a shaft of ash and fire, or a volcano. This is relevant since many Semitic cults worship, chthonic gods like Vulcan, and it's a motif, the worship of these smithing or volcano gods. If you watch the film, you will see time and time again, and looking for it, you notice it like almost every frame, but there's this motif of three triangles, three suns. The three suns are lined up in like a triangle roof, and all of the architecture is adorned with triangles and et cetera, et cetera. There are even three shards that Jen must collect. Now, this is obviously, to me, a reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And again, this harkens to a Semitic cult practiced by the Skeksis. So, and one more thing. In one scene, Chamberlain seems to quote Jesus, which is an odd choice, for Chamberlain. He's not really a Christian figure, a Christ-like figure. When he confronts Jen and Kira in the sewers, he says, "Do not be afraid," which sounds an awful lot like Jesus in Matthew 28 when he says, "Be not afraid." Lastly, what do these Skeksis do? But they collect slaves from various lesser races, the podlings. You can imagine what the podlings might represent. But they collect them using their army of Garthim, which sounds a lot like Golem. These Garthim, at first they look like organic insects, but we know from the final scene of the film they're actually automatons or constructs, which again plays more into this Semitic golem theory about what they might represent. So the Skeksis and the Gelfling, I think, clearly both represent Aryans and Semites clearly, but as everybody knows, the film also includes the Mystics, which are another race found in the film. And here's where I think the analogy gets interesting, because the Skeksis and the Mystics are the same. They are literally identical beings split apart after the shattering of the crystal, which is why there's 10 Skeksis and there's 10 Mystics, again, 10 tribes of Israel. But they're linked together. Like if a Skeksis is harmed, both the Mystic and the Skeksis that are, together, they will incur the same injury. So maybe the Skeksis represent the secular Jews, while the Mystics maybe represent Orthodox Jews. Or I think what's more interesting, the Mystics may represent Christians, and the separation is saying that Jews and Christians might be two sides of the same coin. And there's a lot of similarities. The Mystics, right from their name, are a mystical, religious, ritualistic people. They live in the desert, which is odd enough for the setting. I think it's the only desert we see in the film. apart from, the barren wasteland that the castle is in. But to be fair, the Skeksis apparently, I guess, also live in the desert. But the mystics, they're a pacifistic group of monks, right? And they focus a lot of their time on things like numerology, which harkens to the cult of Pythagoras, which is probably another proto-Semitic cult. And they're quoted saying a lot of things like, we are one in the crystal, right? Or like one in Christ, right? Crystal and Christ actually there might be something there. So possibly the dark crystal represents Christ? Hard to say. Anyways, another interesting thing about the Skeksis and the mystics is at the end of the film, they are implied that they actually don't come from Thra. They don't come from the world. They are actually an alien cult. So this crystal cult, this Christ cult, and themselves are really foreigners to the Gelflings' world. This is another headcanon thing of mine, but when Jen and Kira go to what they call their ancestral ruins, right, which are the last remaining architecture from when the Gelflings, ruled Thra, we notice that there's a lot of symbolism on, like, the architecture. For example, the throne has a triangle on it, which probably represents the three suns, which could say that maybe they're a solar cult. We don't see them that they're worshiping the crystal necessarily. They're not worshiping Christ. They're worshiping the sun. So how is this film REM? Well, it needs to be understood that for a film to be considered to have REM characteristics, it doesn't have to be the intention of the director to even give the REM messages. I said a lot of crazy stuff here, and, you could take it that there's some truth, or maybe there's no truth. But the film simply needs to inform genetics through its messaging. And even if everything I listed was merely coincidental, purely up to chance, that wouldn't discredit the film as being classified as AIM. It would only need to inform genetics through storytelling. And this is where I think the argument is strongest. See, Jen and Kira, as a young child, when you view this, these are Aryan analogs. You do sympathize with them and kind of see yourself in these characters. And it's implied that they're the last of their race on the planet. And I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to say that this is a deeply racial natalist narrative of the last Aryans who are struggling against this cult of, Christian-coded, lizard people, and, they're tasked with, again, saving their race as the last two members of their race. They're not depicted as finding exotic partners or foreign partners. They're members of the same tribe. And again, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to say that this possibly influenced personally how I searched for a partner into my adulthood from my childhood. Which is to say that REM theory, and I think we can all agree with this across political spectrums, it's just fundamentally true. Stories will affect our decisions, and they will affect our selection of partners in myth. And it's important to see how storytelling can be used to see how they affect genes and peoples. So this is my example. I wanted to bring this up because for a long time I always thought that this film had very... not anti-Semitic, but very, triple parentheses, them, messaging. So I wanted to get this out there, and thank you for watching.
And you, O Lord Apollo, god of the silver bow, shooting now afar.